I argued recently, in fact, at Oxford Union, and they didn't get the point because they're all woke. But the students, but there were, there was a debate
That's
on.
terrible. That's a terrible thing.
I
If
know,
that's
but
the case, it's so terrible.
You'll be surprised. There was a debate on. The question was, we are all religious, and I asked to speak on the pro side. My colleagues, my atheist colleagues, who people were on the anti side, and they were shocked that I wanted to speak on the pro side. And my argument was quite simple: if we weren't all religious, we wouldn't need science. If we didn't all want to believe,
right? That's exactly right, man. That's exactly right.
Okay, so we agree. I mean, they didn't get the point, and I would argue.
Yeah, well, that was part of what I was trying to point out to Sam Harris is that, and this is something I learned at least in part from reading Jung. Like his claim was that alchemy, the ideas of alchemy grew out of a religious foundation, and then science emerged out of alchemy. Yeah. It's like it's nested. Science is nested inside an alchemical fantasy that's nested inside a religious fantasy.
Well, I wouldn't say nested. I would say it grew out of it. Like I was born from my mother and father who, and I like to think that that a lot of who I am is that, but I grew out of it.
Here's why I think it has to be nested still. Okay. Now, and this is something we could talk about a lot. The objects that draw a scientist's attention aren't determined by scientific processes. The fantasy, you see what I mean, is that you get interested in some things and you pursue those. Now that's informed by your scientific knowledge, but so Jung's point, for example, was that science was a materialist redemptive myth that grew up as a counterposition to the spiritualist redemptive myth, right? So you imagine there was an idea, which was that we could redeem our inadequacy through spiritual discipline. Okay, we tried that for a long time. It wasn't enough. People were still suffering from leprosy. Yeah. Okay, so there's a fantasy emerges over thousands of years. Maybe we should investigate the transformations of matter. There's redemptive information residing in the transformations of matter. We could investigate that, and that would make life better. And so the motivational goal behind science is the expansion of human competence. And that's not a scientific goal. That's a motivational goal.
Yeah, I agree with you, but where I guess that we disagree, and we could have this discussion, is that I think you're right. And that's what I said before. Scientists are people. So they're motivated by all. They're motivated by greed, by fame, by jealousy, as well as by facts.
By awe.
Awe and wonder. I mean, I want to point out, I mean, we're all, that's why I'm a scientist. I'm demonstrating about awe and wonder and fascination. But I'm also, the questions I ask are partly determined by the time in which I live. So, but I don't want to be postmodern, because the point is that what's great, so that's all true from a psychological perspective. So you may say that the motivations of science are kind of a personal fantasy. But what's great is that science overcomes that, so that you're right. In fact, in my book, in the book you read, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far, I make a big point of saying scientists were all moving in this direction, and it was the wrong direction.
But it doesn't overcome the motivation. It doesn't overcome the motivation. It overcomes the contamination of the theory by the motivational impulse.
But the motivation changes because the results force it upon you. Scientists are forced, kicking and screaming, to change their minds. They don't want to. But that motivation of the kind of questions you ask and that's the greatness of science, because it's empirical, because it's not based on just what I want, but what nature tells me is the case. And so eventually, all the scientists who want this, and no doubt were driven in that direction because they wanted that, find out that want is wrong, and they have to go over here. And that's the beauty of science. It's that nature determines what's beautiful ultimately. There was a while when string theorists talked about the elegant universe and all that. Elegant and beauty don't matter. Nature determines it, not scientists. And eventually we get drawn until we eventually come to a picture where we think it's beautiful. But it was nature, something that was incredibly ugly in the beginning that we thought was ugly ends up being beautiful because we force our picture to understand that that's the way it really is. And then we develop an understanding of it. But so that's the beauty. It's that I guess I don't think of it as a fantasy in that sense. Maybe the motivation is fantastical, and even the process at some level.
Well, there's a proposition, right? Which I think look. Let me give you another example of this, and you tell me what you think.
Okay.
Okay. So, I'll try to formulate this properly. Although I may not be able to do it. we have a hypothesis
Mm-hmm.
that's a fantasy, I would say, that the increase of knowledge through technical means will be of benefit to us as individuals and as a species. Okay, that is a fantasy. Now, it may be accurate. It's the fantasy that we've staked ourselves on, but it's not provable, and we're actually ambivalent about it because we generate apocalyptic nightmares all the time, and we know that our technological prowess has a Frankenstein element.
Sure.
So it's not like we're 100% convinced that this nonstop onslaught of knowledge generation is necessarily in our best interests. And you could also make a case, an evolutionary case, that most species are stunningly conservative. If something works, man, they do not deviate from it,
Sure.
whereas we're just transforming like mad. And so we do have this fantasy, which is we can escape our static destiny by the acquisition of knowledge, by going out into the unknown. That's Star Trek, right?
Yeah.
He wrote books on the physics of Star Trek, to go boldly where no one has gone beyond before,
Yeah.
and that will be of net benefit to us. And that's the fantasy within which this is nested. I don't think that does change.
Well,
I mean, I understand your point. Within that, there's transformations constantly.
I think it wouldn't. Well, look, I agree with you to the most part. And in fact, regarding the apocalyptic things, one of the things you didn't mention is that I was chairman of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist for a dozen years that sets the doomsday clock. So every year I'd have to stare apocalypse right in the face. But I think the reason that fantasy has persisted, I would argue, is that it, like many fantasies, is that it has an evolutionary success. And the reason
I agree.
and the reason that it persists is that we have found that, yeah, when we developed antibiotics, we can live longer. I mean, so there's a hope, and you're right. And it comes back to what I said before. Reason is a slave of passion. I recognize that when I think I'm being driven by pure rationality, I have to recognize that there's passion behind it.
Well, that's it. This is so okay. And I think part of that, again, this is something I tried to draw out in my conversations with Harris, is, well, we are evolved biological creatures. We're motivationally driven. We have a pattern. We are not rational. That's wrong. Now, we can learn to be rational with great difficulty.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, and maybe that's a tool, but there is underneath this, you said it was an instinct. So we could take that apart a little bit.
Yeah.
So the prefrontal cortex grew out of the motor cortex.
Mm-hmm.
So the motor cortex enables you to engage in voluntary activity.
Yeah.
The prefrontal cortex enables you to abstractly represent motor activity, play it out in an avatar-like universe, and kill off stupid ideas before they kill you. So we've evolved to produce hypotheses, test them through dialectic often, and dispense with those that don't work. And so we've staked ourselves on that attempt, and we've evolved to be able to do that. And science, I believe, is the extension of that, the practical extension of that.
The most successful practical extension, I would argue.
Yes, it's so successful so far, right?
Yeah, so far.
We have the time frame problem.
Yeah, exactly.
So on the apocalyptic end, let me ask you what you think of this. So we have a particular view of a hydrogen atom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's very reductionistic, right? And you can see the power of that because we understand hydrogen atoms well enough to turn them into bombs.
Yeah.
But you could also argue that it's because of the limitations of that form of knowledge that we were inclined to turn them into bombs, that we separated the hydrogen atom from its context, its broad context. It enabled us to manipulate a tiny fragment of reality to exclude the rest of reality from that consideration. That bestowed upon us a tremendous power, but look what it produced. It produced the hydrogen bomb. And, that could be evidence that the theory, however practically useful for producing deadly machinery, was not useful at all at a larger scale of analysis. That's the paradox, I guess, of the reductionistic approach.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, reminds me of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, a movie with Mickey Mouse or whatever it was, I think
Mickey Mouse. Yeah.
And is a sense that it is a remarkable. Well, or maybe I should do Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. But which may be a summary of your book. But anyway, we have this weird, I can't agree with you more. We have this weird dichotomy. We've discovered science. the scientific method was a discovery. It took a while to discover it. When the Greeks didn't have it, they did a lot, but if they'd been able to know about empirical evidence, they would have done a lot more. And so it was a discovery, and it's a discovery that was incredibly powerful, that works. But we humans, didn't evolve to discover the scientific method. I mean, we had the capability, and therefore we have all sorts of evolutionary baggage that makes us human. And so we're, on the one hand, have this incredible power by using the scientific method, but on the other hand, have the fact that we are human, and we have all the slings and arrows that came with being human, all of the evolutionarily positive and negative features of having developed a psyche as you described it. One with, I had a podcast with Joseph Ledoux. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah,
We talked a great deal about fear in the amygdala and how those things play out. But so we have the people that are manipulating this scientific method who are subject to all of the concerns that may, the jealousies, the insecurities, and the wonder all combined. And somehow we have to combine those to keep us safe and secure, and to make, in principle, a better. Again, just saying we want a better future for our children. You're right. That's a fantasy too. That's a claim. It doesn't have to be. Why do we want to do that? Well, for some reason we think it's a good idea. Maybe
for some reason we believe that there's such thing as better.
Yeah.
Right?
And we quantify it, and again, I would argue. See, to me, I'm a solid empiricist. If there's not an empirical way of defining why it's better, then it's an irrelevant concept, and that's why I'm a very pedestrian kind of guy. If you can't measure it, don't talk about it to some extent. And so,
if you can't measure it, you can't define it, and then it's hard to tell what the hell you're talking about.
Then it just ends up being semantics. Then it ends up being pure intellectual masturbation, which is a lot of.
Yeah, and you can shift the concept around at your convenience, which is not helpful.
And that's what sort of, I would argue, much of postmodernism is all about. Is that it's lost track of what is real, and it just sort of intellectual circles.